What is up, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Not So Stupid Podcast. Today's episode, we have special guest, registered psychotherapist Natalie Rose. She specializes in disordered eating and eating disorders, which are two very different things, although kind of similar. And Natalie really helped me open my eyes in a lot of ways that people with disordered eating patterns kind of view the world, view themselves, view the food they're eating, and how to kind of combat that and overcome it to a degree, or at least take the steps necessary to go to a healthier state of mind, healthier eating patterns, healthier body image perceptions, which we get into the podcast. And I'm super excited for you guys to listen to it because she drops a lot of gems throughout the episode that I try to point out, but there was just too many. So make sure you listen closely to everything she has to say. Now, without further ado, let's get right into the interview. Here is the podcast episode with Natalie Rose. All right, Natalie Rose, welcome to the podcast. How are you doing today?
Hi, good. Thank you. How are you?
I'm doing great. I'm doing awesome now that you're on the show with us right now. Really excited to have you on and share your story. So, on that topic, can you kind of tell us a little bit of who you are, what you do, and how you ended up in the position you are today?
Yes, so I'm a registered psychotherapist. I'm from Toronto. I'm specializing in disordered eating and eating disorders. And I didn't always know that I wanted to be a therapist, or especially one that worked with eating disorders, but I sort of found my way here. And part of that has to do with my Instagram, which is also how we connected.
hmm What how did you end up being interested in that? Like what led to that course of action kind of?
Well, it's actually so interesting because when I look back, I remember that I used to love shows like Intervention,
hmm
and especially the ones where they showed people with eating disorders. Like I just was fascinated in eating disorders, and I understood for some reason on some level that it wasn't just about food, it was about underlying psychological experiences and trauma and things like that. And it's so weird also because in, I think, the ninth grade, we always had to do speeches every year. Every year you could do a speech and you could choose your topic. And I chose to write about eating disorders, which is so random. But I was talking about how they had to do with anxiety and things like that. Anyways, fast forward, like I went to university for business. I didn't have any
mm
plans to do psychology or therapy or anything related to eating disorders, but I just fell in love with my Psych 101 class. And I guess I just grew an interest of wanting to understand people and also to understand myself. Like it just helped to learn about human behavior and things like that. Um, and so while I was doing my master's, so I ended up switching my major into psychology. Then a few years later, went back to do my master's in clinical and counseling psychology. And while I was doing that, I started an Instagram where I would post my breakfast every morning. And I was very much into like my health and wellness journey and documenting that and talking about my experiences with disordered eating, and overcoming dieting, which for me, dieting was sort of like a symptom of disordered eating. So I would share that, and I grew a following of people who also experienced disordered eating. And they would ask me questions, and sometimes I wouldn't have the answer to their questions. Like a really common one was, how do I stop calorie counting?
mm
And for me personally, I had used calorie counting apps in the past, but it didn't really become something that was obsessive or that I had trouble stopping.
mhm.
Like I would just one day I would just get busy and forget to track. And so didn't feel like something I couldn't stop. So I didn't know how to answer their questions.
Mhm.
And so that led me to look into it more and more. And I just kept, I ended up finishing my master's, which in nothing related to eating disorders, but I kept doing courses and professional development and workshops and things like that. And then just decided to specialize in eating disorders, especially as my Instagram grew and I sort of began to merge like this what was a fun blog into my therapy and practice.
That's so cool that your Instagram and the people that were following you kind of steered you in a way, even
They
though it
really
steered you
did.
naturally, right?
Yeah, yeah, it steered me into what was already, like, an innate interest that I'd had from years ago that I
Mhm.
forgot about because I was following what I thought I should be doing, like, doing trying to, do the business thing, and, so it was really interesting that, like, doing that hobby, like, just doing what made me feel good helped steer me in the right direction. I think that's what I learned from it.
Wow, that's so amazing. That's like such a powerful insight in that, you were kind of just being yourself and at the same time trying to do the thing you should be doing. But in being yourself, you found out what you really should be doing, like what's best for Natalie herself, right?
Yeah, yeah.
That's kind that's kind of amazing. So there's a lot of cool points that you touched on that I want to expand on. But there was one sentence that you said that I think was really interesting. And you said that in your experience, dieting was a symptom of disordered eating. Can you expand on what you mean by that and what you found in like digging deeper with that with yourself?
Yeah. So dieting is so complex, as I'm sure you know, because it's something that we learn is normal and we're encouraged to diet, and there's so many different kinds of diets. Um, and I think like the first thing I want to say is just that not everyone who diets develops an eating disorder, or not everyone who diets has disordered eating patterns. But it is something that can trigger an eating disorder. And I guess that's really dependent on um, certain factors that may predispose you to developing an eating disorder, something that you can't really see or know, like
Hmm.
genetic differences, perceptual differences. Um, for example, tendencies towards obsessive and compulsive behaviors, so those things you don't really know, and unfortunately, a lot of people start diets with the intention of just being healthy or um, losing weight if that's what they feel like they need to do, and it can a lot of the time result in disordered eating behaviors and eating disorders.
That's actually really cool for you to say. I like that you mentioned how they have certain behavioral tendencies that translate to dieting. One that I think of that I see pretty often is people that are kind of all or nothing, right? Or go on to the
Yes.
extremes of things. And that's how
Mhm.
they handle their work, their professional career. And now that when they go into dieting, they're like, I have to be absolutely perfect to a T with everything. I can't have this
Yes.
100% of the time. And that kind of leads to that, poorer relationship with food, right?
Yes, exactly.
Nice. That's really cool. So now, we mentioned disorder eating a couple times. Can you actually define that? Because I don't think we actually said what that means yet. Because I
Yeah.
think people might feel like disorder eating is more extreme, but it's actually kind of more common than people realize, I feel like. So if you would like to expand on that.
Yeah, disordered eating is really common. I would say that disordered eating and eating disorders, it all lies on a spectrum. So, whereas eating disorders, you'll see more of obsessions and compulsions, metabolic damage, like extreme weight loss or weight gain. With disordered eating, it can look something like yo yo dieting. Um, the cycle of dieting, then overeating and dieting and overeating, having strict food rules, not allowing yourself to eat certain foods because you view them as bad, cutting out major food groups like eliminating carbs, having body image issues. So we can talk more about that after. That's like a whole other
Hmm.
thing, but over exercising, avoiding activities because someone's ashamed of their weight, or because they're avoiding eating certain foods, avoiding eating in front of others, doing crash diets, juice cleansing diets. Um, so all those things sort of show up as disordered eating, and it is sort of hard to tease out because a lot of those things seem very normal and do happen very frequently.
Hmm. Yeah, I like how you ended it on that because normality is really just something you repeat over and over again until it's
Yeah.
what you know and what you're familiar with. But just because it's
Hmm.
normal doesn't mean it's, the proper way to go about things by any
Yeah.
means. So what would, on that thought process, what would true normal look like, a healthy normal look like for a person, an individual that maybe felt like they related to some of these symptoms and didn't realize it was a disordered eating pattern? What would that healthy eating pattern look like?
I think the biggest factor in healthy eating is flexibility.
Mm,
So, one of the main things in disordered eating and eating disorders is this rigidity, like that black or white. It has to be one way or the other. There's no in between. So, flexibility, you can really love eating like nutrient dense foods, and you can go out to a restaurant and have something that's, not super nutrient dense, but is
mhm,
delicious. And um, so there's that flexibility there. I would say an absence of anxiety or shame, like something that also comes up a lot in disordered eating and eating disorders, is this like really intense shame about food choices where it becomes like a moral thing where if you eat a food that you consider bad, then you feel like you're a bad person.
mhm,
Um, whereas with a healthy relationship with food, you realize like food is just food. It's, if you eat something, it does not say anything about your worth as a person or your success and things like that. So, just off the top of my head, I would say those are the two most important things about healthy eating, that you're meeting your nutritional needs, but also your emotional needs, cultural needs, social needs, all the other things that go into eating and the purpose that it serves for us.
mhm. That's that's actually really insightful. I love that a lot because, um, when I think about those two things that you brought up, flexibility and absence of anxiety and shame, I think about like myself going out to eat with my friends. Obviously, I'm the health and fitness guy. So like people are more honed in my decision making and what I do when I go out, but also they get a little self-conscious about their own decision making, even though they don't have to be. Um,
Yeah.
and sometimes, I'll be the person that says yes to a few different desserts. And some days I'll be like, no, I don't really want the desserts. I'm just kind of listening to my body. And they kind of get surprised. Different people will get surprised in both of those circumstances. Like, whoa, you're supposed to be the health and fitness guy. How are you okay with having a cake right now? And then the other people that know me a little bit better, they'll be like, don't you preach having cake whenever you want? Why aren't you having cake right now? We're all having cake. So I think there's a very deep rooted perception around how things should be. And how it ties into how other people view your eating habits, because I'm sure if they're saying that to me, they're probably feeling that within themselves. Those are the thoughts they're having when they're making their own food decisions, right? It's a really hard balance to make, but it really comes down to kind of having a confidence with the decisions you're making and being okay with it. But it's really hard to get to, don't you think?
Yeah, I think we're human, and anything that feels like a judgment, it can be really hurtful on so many different levels.
Oh,
And you're right, people are really just projecting their own anxieties or their own questions, or honestly, sometimes they're just noticing a difference in what they perceive, your behavior should look like, and then what is
mhm,
actually happening, and they're just making a comment about that, like noticing a discrepancy, and that, has nothing to do with you or um whether what you're doing is right or wrong. It's really just them sort of noticing something and commenting on it, but it can definitely feel like a judgment, and can make, someone really anxious about going out to eat because just based on the judgments that they know they will receive. Like
mhm.
most of the time it's, we get comments like that, and so it's really hard to stop them. And oftentimes it does happen even when you've, told someone, "Hey, could you please not make comments like that, or that makes me feel kind of judged." It happens, and so it,
Mhm.
it can be really hard. for sure.
Yeah, no, I like it definitely happens, especially like when I work with clients going to family events and,
Yeah.
get-togethers and things like that. They might have told their aunt or mom like, "Hey, I don't want to talk about this," but they never fail to bring it up every single time you see them.
Yep. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
no, that's not fun at all. I think really good points though. So I want to kind of steer, someone can relate to all of this, right? But then it's what can they do to move away from where they currently are? How, first of all, they probably have created some awareness, right, from listening to us to this point. But what can they do with that awareness to move away from those current thought patterns or behaviors that they have? What do you usually recommend as a good first step?
The first step would be really about gaining self-awareness around where these beliefs about food or judgments around food or restricted patterns or things like that
Hmm.
are coming from, because a lot of the time it is learned. And then a lot of the time it's also relating to that rigidity. Like, do I have difficulty being in the gray area, or am I someone who feels a lot more comfortable viewing things as either good or bad? Like, just having knowing that as a personality characteristic can be helpful, because then that means you can sort of challenge this in other areas besides food as well.
Hmm.
Um, so for example, recently, I was talking with a colleague who had recognized something like that, similar to herself, where she feels better when things are done a certain way. So
Hmm.
she challenged herself, like early on in her recovery, to do things differently. So instead of, she would always load the dishwasher in a certain way, she
Hmm.
would load it differently. And that, like that, like angst would come up and that judgmental thoughts and things like that. And she would have to remind herself, like, I'm still a good person, even though I'm doing something differently.
Hmm.
Or she would like brush her teeth with her non-dominant hand, to get into the practice of actually like changing her brain to becoming more comfortable with doing things that feel uncomfortable. Because
Hmm.
that's really what this is all about, is that someone can struggle with disordered eating or even an eating disorder and can know that these behaviors are not helping them and actually making them feel worse, but it can feel even more uncomfortable to do something differently.
Hmm.
So I think starting off with really small changes, and getting any support that they can as well. So maybe that's challenging certain foods or going out to eat maybe more than they currently are, or doing things that make them feel uncomfortable essentially.
I'm really glad you brought it up as, it being very uncomfortable to change, because I think
Hmm.
like people want to transition to things seamlessly. They see, they might be listening to us talking, right, and feeling that we're pretty confident with how we approach our food. I want to be like them, but it wasn't like a straightforward pass or a walk through the door that we just changed our behaviors. It took a lot of time and learning and practicing to get to that point, and there's a lot of discomfort through that.
Hmm.
What you said reminded me of a quote that a coach of mine says when, trying to help people change their body, change their behaviors, is you can't get someone to change until the pain of where they're at is worse than the pain of trying to change. The discomfort of where you're at has to get to the point where changing becomes less uncomfortable. What
Hmm.
do you think about that kind of idea and topic? Because I think, you can never force anyone to change, no matter how well intentioned you are. They have to want to do it themselves. But um, where do you fall on this idea that the pain has to be terrible first before changing?
That one is so tricky because I'll often have clients, especially some of my younger clients, who are in treatment not because they want to be there, but because their health is compromised, or it could be compromised, and their parents are, sort of making them start recovery. And it's really, really tricky. Like, you're right, you can't force someone to be motivated or to want to change. And it's very tricky. It's really about meeting that person where they're at.
Mm,
So validating that, yeah, it is really hard to want to change if you don't feel like you're at rock bottom. And you'll often hear that, like you have to let someone get to rock bottom before they can change. And I do think that that applies in a lot of situations. And in other situations, someone may never feel motivated to recover or to change their patterns. Um, and that could be fatal, right? Like eating
mhm.
disorders are actually the second most lethal mental health disorder.
Oh, wow.
um yeah, it's pretty serious. And so, you have to sometimes see that their perception of what is rock bottom could be really off too.
Mhm,
Maybe they've been through a lot and they can handle a lot of stuff that's really, really difficult. And so maybe their perception of what their rock bottom is
mhm,
could be off from maybe the average person. So yeah, I don't know if that answered your question, but I always just try to help, I guess, the person decide for themselves,
mhm,
what will things look like if you sort of maintain the status quo, if you sort of stay where you're at, and what could things look like, in your ideal world.
mhm. No, I love that. You definitely answered my question, but the one thing you said that was really new to me is people's perception of what rock bottom looks like. Like how, you know, people say, "I'll change when I get to this point," right? When, um, I start not fitting in my double XL clothes or something, like that's their rock bottom in their mind. Like I can never get to that point, right?
Mhm.
And that's when they finally feel like they need to change. But for someone else, it's like when I get to a size 6 or a size 4, it's like, man, I'm way too big. I got to get smaller, especially with the women. And it comes down to something we touched on earlier that we want to bring back of body image, right? And how they view themselves, how they view the body that they're in, and how they view how their body moves and how they use it, right? And how other people view their own body too. Where, well, first of all, can you talk about and define what body image issues are and what influences it? I feel like it's going to be overlapping with earlier points, but I still want to hear what you got to say.
For sure. Body image is is really like a subjective image of what someone has of their own body that's not really related to how their body actually looks. Like it could be their thoughts, feelings, the way they evaluate their body, and like the behaviors that they choose around their body. So body image issues are it could range again, like from sort of dissatisfaction to something like what's called body dysmorphic disorder, which is like on the spectrum of OCD, like something that can be really severe where someone has no insight into how distorted their body image is. Like they
Mhm.
can perceive that either certain parts or multiple parts of their body are flawed or defective, and it whereas another person may view them and not think that at all. So it could be something that perceptually is very real to them but not for other people.
Mhm.
um, it's it yeah, it really has to do with the behaviors around their body. Body image issues often involve some kind of uh, like a really negative evaluation of either their whole body or parts of their body, and behaviors like repetitive behaviors to either maintain their appearance or to check to see if their appearance is changing, or avoidance behaviors like avoiding looking at their body or avoiding going out, where they might be subjected to judgment. It can be feel really obsessive and compulsive, or it can be sort of um, a minor disturbance. Yeah, there's really, really a huge range.
Mhm. Yeah, no, that's actually really amazing. I had someone on the podcast prior who had these similar issues, and she was she really felt like she was a fat person. She really felt like she was a fat person, but she was a top CrossFit athlete, competitor, had a six pack, had all the muscles, the vascularity, but still, despite all of that, being as lean as womanly possible, she felt like she was still too big. She still felt like she had too much fat on her. She needed to get leaner, right? And that's like, they're viewing it through a certain lens that is really different than what everyone else is perceiving and is what is actually happening with their body. But how can you can't just tell someone, right? Like you mentioned, you can't just tell someone, hey, that's not true. And they'll be like, oh, yeah, you're right. It's not true. It doesn't change like that. How can you get them to see reality and look through it in a different lens, be more objective in that regard, if that's even possible? Um, yeah.
I think it's possible for some people. I think it's more so about not helping them change their perception, but helping them come to a place where they can accept that their perception is distorted and that they
Mhm.
can't always trust their perception of their body.
Mm.
Um, so, like I said, with some people with body dysmorphic disorder, they might have no insight into that they even have a perceptual difference, right? Like they're the ones who are just going straight to um, the cosmetic surgery to change something. Like they think it's a physical distortion
Mhm.
rather than a psychological one, or perhaps, yeah, like doing diet programs or personal training, just constantly trying to change the physical aspect. Whereas some people do have more insight into it and can understand that whether it's body dysmorphia or it's an eating disorder, that the way that they perceive their body is off. And often like that discrepancy in perception is exacerbated by disordered eating. So malnutrition can actually enhance those whatever's happening in their brain,
Mhm. Oh,
that
wow.
disconnect. Mhm.
Hmm, that's really crazy. I like that you brought it back, like kind of zoomed into more so the root cause of it, and that is their perception. Not so much trying to change their mind about their perception, but helping them again, like kind of just be aware that you need to look at this through a different lens. You have to not believe everything you're thinking right from the get go because uh, we recognize it to be not accurate. And then they kind of start questioning themselves, questioning their own perception, kind of like extrapolating it, imagining being that person. They kind of just have a thought, think about that thought, and then try to reframe it. Because I'm assuming how they can relearn or unlearn that old perception and find a new perception for themselves. Is that kind of the right thought process I'm having?
Yeah, that's one way
Okay.
is to reframe it and, to acknowledge that a thought or a perception can be distorted and try to reframe it. And another way is just to acknowledge that it's there and to not really buy into it.
Hmm.
To notice that, I'm having distorted thoughts about my body or I'm having negative thoughts about my body, and that makes sense because of what I'm feeling or because of the experiences I've had or because that's the way my brain works or whatever.
Hmm.
And I'm going to choose not to buy into it or to listen to it because I know that my thoughts aren't always an accurate reflection of what's happening or even what's important to me. And so
Hmm.
maybe I'll focus on doing something else that feels good for me or making sure that I'm doing everything I can to treat myself well.
Hmm. I like that because it's kind of like when you have that one friend that always exaggerates everything and you learn not to believe everything they say because they always exaggerate everything, you're kind of doing that with your own thoughts,
Yeah,
which, using that analogy is cool because it creates a distance between them and their thoughts, right? And now they're not really looking at themselves as someone that has poor perception. They're looking at their perception as a separate thing that they have influence over and they can manipulate, which I think is really cool. It takes away from further shaming themselves and feeling worse about it.
exactly.
I love that. Okay, so now we talked about what body image issues look like. I do want to, touch on healthy body image, what that looks like, what that feels like, and what that experience can look like for people. So they, if they're not there yet, they know what to kind of work toward.
Yeah. I think it's important to realize that no one has a perfect body image.
Mm,
Everyone has, moments or days when they don't feel great in their body, and that's normal and healthy. But I think for the most part, a person can feel comfortable in their body. Um, their perception of themselves and their self-worth isn't overly influenced by their physical appearance. They can appreciate the diversity of people's bodies, or, for example, they can appreciate one person's beauty based on that person's unique features without questioning their own beauty or their own self-worth.
mhm,
And they can appreciate another person's beauty who has totally different features. They see variations in beauty, they know it's subjective. Um, they value their personality, skills, and character. So they realize that, body image isn't fully encompassing their view of themselves anymore.
mhm,
They can also accept bodily changes as a normal part of life. I think, it's hard for anyone, I think, to experience major changes in their body. I think we all get really accustomed to one way. We attach, certain memories and things to the way that we looked. And so I think it can be difficult for anyone to acknowledge that their body's changing. But
mm,
someone with a healthy body image can really acknowledge that that's a normal part of life.
mhm.
Um, yeah, I think that's most of it, and that they, no matter how badly they might be feeling about their body on a certain day, that doesn't change the way that they eat or take care of themselves. I think that's really important. They respect their body and respect themselves no matter what.
Mhm. I love the way you framed certain things because in ways that I've never put into words in that way, which I think is really awesome. That I'm getting these new ideas and I'm loving everything you're saying. That when you have a healthy body image, it's not you don't get tied down to one right way of what a good body image looks like. You recognize that everything or lots of variation beauty has lots of variations. It's not one fixed definition of what beauty looks like, and that's true for yourself as well. And to kind of expand on one point you said that I think is helpful, and it's kind of how I like to frame it with clients that are always trying to go back to how they used to look is, you're a different person right now. And even though you looked great then, you can still look great and look different at the same time with your future body. And it doesn't mean that you're worse because you don't look the same. You're a different person, and different isn't better or worse. It's just different. And you can love that version of yourself. You could love your current version of yourself, and you could love the past version of yourself all the same way. But these changes that your body is going to go through are all natural. They're all meant to happen, and you resisting them only makes that process less enjoyable. Um, what do you have to say about that kind of expansion of your idea?
Yeah, it's so crazy because our body is constantly changing. Like from the moment we're born till the end of our life, our body is constantly changing. And so it's really interesting to see that somewhere along the line, like we've started viewing that as a bad thing, and that we need to look how we did in high school or have the same body weight as we did in high school, or
Mhm,
um, and I think like that really comes down to a lot of the messages we received through the media, right?
mhm,
Like we're constantly being pushed on anti-aging products and things like that. Like if we didn't have that influence, I wonder if we would still feel the same way.
mhm,
Um, but it is really sad to see because often, the times that people are wishing they could go back to, they also didn't like their body image in that moment either. Like,
mhm,
so they're sort of chasing this feeling, and it's really tricky. I think it involves a lot of grief. Like you're grieving this younger version of yourself or thinner version of yourself because you associate that as being a better or more worthy or more respected. I think a lot of it has to do with our fear of other people's perceptions about us. Like if we're getting older, what does that mean about our relationships and how people view us? So, yeah, this is like why body image is so complex, right? It involves so many different messages and feelings and emotions.
Hmm. Yeah, and digging into why a specific person thinks a specific way is very hard because it's so different
Hmm.
between each individual.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
you're so right.
Mhm. No, that's crazy. I think one thing you said that I think is really powerful and probably a lot of people relate to, and I kind of want to repeat and emphasize for everyone listening, is that they want to go back to a previous body, what they look like in high school, what they look like 5 years ago. But if you ask them what they thought when they took that picture, they still didn't like their body in that picture. It was only in like hindsight they finally started liking who they were.
Yeah.
And if they were to fast forward 10 years and look at a picture of themselves now, they probably have the same thought process. And it kind of shows what really needs to change isn't, your body per se, but your perception of your body, how you think about it, like we talked about, and the subjective image you have of yourself, right? Oh, that was really good. I like that. So now I do want to ask because I got curious. You mentioned um, we are in a way persuaded to think a certain way about being youthful, anti-aging, etc., trying not to change our body. What is one of these things that kind of is a pet peeve of yours that you see advertised, that every time you see it, you're just a little ticked off that someone is actually trying to sell this thing to make someone look a certain way?
um, I might have to go with like something that's coming up right now is anti-cellulite or cellulite creams
Hmm.
because that one is targeted like specific to females. And I'll hear that like with my younger clients. I think that's why it pisses me off so much is because I'm like they're and I can relate to this too. I remember feeling really self-conscious about this at one point in my life too, is like it's just such a natural part of a female body. And I learned recently that it's because like males and females, their fat cells are just formed differently or something.
Hmm.
So it creates a different appearance. And it's just something that's so normal. And who decided that that has to be something that's bad and needs to be changed and that we need to feel self-conscious about? And at the root of it, it's just that these companies are profiting off of insecurities, right?
Hmm.
So I think that one bothers me. I'm sure there are more, but that one's coming to me right now.
No, I'm glad you chose that one because I would have chosen that one, because it is like 99% of adult women have cellulite. It's unavoidable. It's just a part of having a body, right?
Mhm.
I think another one for me that really bothers me, especially with like mothers, is stretch marks and trying to, get rid of stretch marks and have that smooth
Yes.
skin. And it's like your body did something really amazing by birthing a child, and these are
Yeah.
kind of your um it's a beautiful thing to look at in a way, right? That you were able to
Yeah.
do this, and they find it and kind of get repulsed with themselves. And some people, to an extreme, regret even having a child because of that, which I think is uh, really, I just think it's really terrible, just all around. So,
Yeah.
like, those two are always my top two when I think of this. Is you don't need to worry about cellulite, getting rid of it. It's natural. It's better to accept it, and also stretch marks shouldn't really put too much pressure on yourself to not have them because they are natural and it's not a bad thing either.
Yeah. Yeah. It's really hard to hear that from your clients. I can totally relate to that. And I experience the same thing as well. Like, mothers and postpartum bodies and all the changes. And I think it also, like, something to highlight is that for some people, these like changes in their body might be even more distressing, even just because of their own neurological functioning. Like there's so perceptual differences that people have, people with body image issues and eating disorders. Um, they've done studies for people with body dysmorphic disorder and notice that their brain actually attends to detail a lot more, where
Mm,
they hyper focus on details and changes, and they were able to like more accurately identify changes between two photos
mm,
than the average person. So it can be a great strength, and then it's also something that is really causing them to hyper focus on differences in what they perceive to be normal versus not normal.
mhm.
And then throw in like the media on top of that, and actually tell people that, you know, you need to get rid of your stretch marks, is that's something that just adds on top of it and makes it so difficult. But
Yeah, no, it's hard. But I hope like people listening to this at least are willing to put in the work to change that perception and be more comfortable with themselves. So we are coming close to the end of our time. I do want to be respectful of your time here. So, um, where can people find you if they want to see more of your work and what you do?
they can find me on Instagram, Wake Up and Smell the Rose, and also through my website, wakeupandsmelltherose.com. I do also have an online course, which is really is pretty simplified and it's self-paced, which can be sort of an introduction into healthy eating and coping with disordered eating in these thought patterns, like the all or nothing thinking that we talked about. And it talks a lot about self-compassion and ways to cope with really intense emotions and things like that. So that's all on my website.
Awesome. Yeah, that is going to be linked for anyone interested in the show notes, so you could check it out right after you listen to this podcast. And now, one last question for you before I let you go. This is the Not So Stupid podcast. We really emphasize simplicity here above all else. So, what is one simple thing that anyone can start doing as soon as they're done listening to this episode to drastically improve their life today? But it can't be walking because I get walking too much. So, I got to think of something else.
Mhm. Yeah, walking is a good one. I would say to be intentional,
Mm,
like to have an intention. If you're eating something, enjoy it, intend to enjoy it. Or if you're making choices about wanting to feel better, choose an intention. Like, how is that something that you're going to do? And be really present when you do it, just to be intentional. I think you can use that at any time. Like, if you're sitting down to do work, set a time of how long you want to do work for and be intentional and do just that. If you want to worry, you can worry and be intentional about that and set a timer and do that and then move on to the next thing. But just to be intentional with everything that you think about and that you do. I think that's something that I would recommend.
I love that. That's one of the most beautiful answers I've heard to date on the podcast because it's simple, it's applicable across like everything you do, and it'll make the biggest difference in how you experience your life, which I think is, the goal is having a good experience in life, right? So I love that. Thank you so much for sharing that.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course. And then again, if you want to see more of Natalie's work, her Instagram, her website are linked in the show notes. Thank you, everyone, for listening. Thank you again, Natalie, for coming on the show. Really, really appreciate it. And we'll see you